The full moon hung like a silver medallion over the Gothic spires of Ravenshire, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Julia Ashcroft stood at her bedroom window, watching as the moving truck pulled away from the mansion across the street. Her new neighbor had arrived under cover of darkness, which seemed fitting for the ancient Victorian estate that had stood empty for as long as she could remember. "Another eccentric recluse," she muttered to herself, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Julia had lived in Ravenshire her entire life, yet never quite belonged. Her grandmother had been the town's renowned herbalist, passing down ancient remedies and folklore that had earned Julia sideways glances from the townspeople. They tolerated her small apothecary shop, but kept their distance. She was always the outsider, the strange woman who lived alone with her herbs and books of forgotten lore. That isolation had become her armor. People were temporary presences in her life. They either feared her knowledge or wanted to exploit it. Better to keep to herself than risk disappointment. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A tall figure stood at the mansion's upper window, silhouetted against amber light. For a breathless moment, Julia felt as though the stranger was looking directly at her. Then the curtains swept closed. She stepped back from the window, chiding herself for staring. It does not matter who moves in. We will all merely coexist as neighbors do, with polite distance. Yet something about that silhouette lingered in her mind as she prepared her evening tea, a blend for dreamless sleep. Julia needed it tonight. Tomorrow marked the autumn equinox, her busiest time at the apothecary, when the veil between worlds grew thin and her customers sought protection against the coming darkness. Morning arrived with a dense fog that clung to Ravenshire like a funeral shroud. Julia opened her shop as usual, arranging protective amulets and herbs harvested under the full moon. The brass bell above her door jingled, announcing the first customer of the day. "I require something for protection against the elements," came a voice like aged whiskey, deep, smooth, with an accent she could not quite place. Julia looked up and felt her prepared greeting die on her lips. The man standing before her was extraordinary. Tall and elegant, with dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on classical sculptures. His eyes were the most unsettling feature, piercing blue that seemed to shift like the ocean during a storm. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that appeared both modern and somehow timeless. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, recovering her composure. "The mansion across from mine." "Ethan Devereux," he replied with a slight bow that seemed from another century. "And you are the apothecary. How fascinating to find such knowledge preserved in this small town." "Julia Ashcroft," she introduced herself, feeling strangely vulnerable under his gaze. "What sort of protection are you looking for?" "Something to reinforce windows against coming storms. I find myself sensitive to certain elements." There was something measured about the way he spoke, as if selecting each word with deliberate care. "Of course, I have several options." Julia moved around her counter, acutely aware of his presence as she gathered supplies. "Are you renovating the mansion? It has been empty for decades." "Reclaiming would be more accurate," Ethan said, tracing a finger along the edge of her wooden counter. "The estate belonged to my family long ago. I have come to restore it to its former glory." Julia handed him a small sachet of herbs. "Place these along your windowsills. They will help against drafts and other unwanted intrusions." Their fingers brushed as he took the packet, and Julia gasped at the contact. His skin was cool, not cold, but lacking the warmth of life. More striking was the jolt of energy that passed between them, like static electricity but far more potent. Ethan stepped back immediately, his expression guarded. "You felt that?" "It was not a question." "I am sensitive to energies," Julia admitted carefully. "My grandmother taught me." "Interesting." His eyes studied her with new intensity. "The Ashcroft name. I believe our families have history." Before Julia could question him further, the bell jangled again as Mrs. Winters, the mayor's wife, entered the shop. "I will return," Ethan said quietly, placing several large bills on the counter. Far more than the sachet was worth. We have much to discuss, Julia Ashcroft. He departed with fluid grace, leaving Julia staring after him. Mrs. Winters clicked her tongue disapprovingly. That is the new owner of Ravenshire Manor? There is something not right about him, she said, leaning conspiratorially across the counter. My husband says he only conducts business after sundown. Very peculiar. Julia nodded absently, her thoughts on the electric sensation of his touch and his cryptic words about their families. What history could the Ashcrofts possibly share with someone like Ethan Devereux? That evening, as darkness fell over Ravenshire, Julia found herself drawn to her window once more. The mansion across the street blazed with light, illuminating stained glass windows that had been dark for generations. As she watched, a procession of delivery trucks arrived, furniture, artwork, crates labeled with foreign destinations. Her doorbell rang, startling her from her observations. She descended the stairs cautiously. Visitors after dark were unusual in Ravenshire. When she opened the door, a small wooden chest sat on her porch. No delivery person in sight. The ornate box was carved with symbols she recognized from her grandmother's most ancient texts, protective runes and wards against darkness. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a handwritten note on heavy parchment. Miss Ashcroft, these belong to your ancestor Elizabeth Ashcroft. They were entrusted to my family's care centuries ago. It is time they returned to their rightful owner. E. Devereux. Julia's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with intricate drawings of herbs, rituals, and creatures thought to exist only in mythology. Her ancestors' elegant script detailed encounters with beings of extraordinary power, vampires. Not the Hollywood monsters of modern fiction, but ancient, noble creatures bound by sacred covenants. And among the entries, one name appeared repeatedly: Devereux. Impossible, Julia whispered. But even as she denied it, pieces began falling into place. His aversion to sunlight, his otherworldly presence, the coolness of his skin. She was still reading when her windows rattled with a sudden gust of wind. Thunder rolled across the sky as storm clouds gathered with supernatural speed. The pages of the journal fluttered to an entry dated 1693. The Devereux covenant is broken. The curse now binds them. Only blood freely given from a true Ashcroft under the blood moon can restore what was lost. Lightning illuminated her living room, and Julia gasped. Ethan stood outside her window, rain streaming down his face, his eyes now an unnatural luminous blue. Invite me in, Julia. His voice somehow carried through the glass. Please, we have little time. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Julia moved to her door and opened it. Come in, Ethan Devereux. He entered with a rush of cold air and the scent of rain, bringing an ancient power that made the air vibrate around him. Up close, his inhuman beauty was even more apparent, perfect and timeless. You found the journal, he said, his gaze falling on the open book. Then you know what I am. A vampire, Julia said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. But the legends are mostly nonsense, he finished, removing his wet coat. Holy water is merely water. Crosses are simply symbols. But blood is everything. Power, memory, covenant. Why have you come to Ravenshire now? And why give me this? She gestured to the journal. Ethan's expression darkened. Because the blood moon approaches, and with it, my last chance to break the curse. Your ancestor, Elizabeth, was more than just an herbalist. She was a guardian of the veil between worlds, and my family's closest ally. Until something happened in 1693, Julia said, looking down at the journal entry. Yes, his voice carried centuries of regret. My brother betrayed our covenant with the Ashcrofts. He took blood by force rather than through willing sacrifice. The consequences were devastating. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning cracking across the sky in jagged forks. What is this curse? Julia asked, though part of her feared the answer. With each blood moon, members of my line fade from existence, our immortality becoming our prison. We do not die, we simply cease to be, our consciousness trapped between worlds. He moved to her window, staring out at the raging storm. I am the last of the Devereux line. This blood moon will be my last unless the covenant is renewed. And you need an Ashcroft's blood, Julia concluded, her heart racing. My blood. Freely given, Ethan emphasized, turning back to her. I would never take it by force. That was my brother's sin, and we have paid for it through centuries of suffering. Julia studied him, this immortal being standing in her modest living room. How do I know this is not some elaborate deception? In answer, Ethan moved to her fireplace and placed his hand directly into the flames. When he withdrew it, his skin was unmarked. I cannot create illusions, Julia. It is against our nature to deceive in matters of covenant. He stepped closer, and despite her fear, Julia did not retreat. There is more you should know, he continued. The connection between our families runs deeper than alliance. The first Ashcroft to offer blood to my line gained certain gifts: longevity, perception beyond human limits, immunity to disease. Have you never wondered why you sense energies others cannot? Why your remedies work when modern medicine fails? Julia thought of her grandmother, who had lived to nearly 100 yet looked 60, whose intuition bordered on prescience. She thought of her own uncanny ability to diagnose ailments with a touch, to sense storms before they formed. The Ashcroft gifts have been fading with each generation, Ethan explained. Without renewing the covenant, they will disappear entirely. And if I help you break this curse, what happens then? The covenant is restored. Your gifts would strengthen, and I would be free to exist without the shadow of obliteration hanging over me. His expression softened. I have existed for over 5 centuries, Julia. I have seen empires rise and fall, witnessed humanity's greatest achievements and darkest hours. Yet in all that time, I have never begged for anything. I am begging now. The vulnerability in his immortal eyes stirred something within her. All her life, Julia had been isolated by her differences. Here was someone who not only understood her gifts but offered an explanation for them. I need time, she said finally, to read this journal, to understand what I would be agreeing to. Ethan nodded, relief evident in his face. The blood moon rises in 3 nights. Until then, I will answer any questions you have. He moved toward the door but paused. Be careful in town tomorrow. My arrival has stirred old memories. Ravenshire has not forgotten the Devereux name, even if they do not remember why they fear it. After he left, Julia stayed awake until dawn, devouring her ancestors' journal. Elizabeth Ashcroft had not merely known of vampires. She had been their human emissary, a bridge between worlds. The covenant had brought prosperity to both families, protection and knowledge to the Ashcrofts, stability and power to the Devereux. Until the betrayal, until blood was taken rather than given. The next morning, Julia went to her shop with dark circles under her eyes, but a new awareness of her place in Ravenshire's hidden history. The town seemed different now, its Gothic architecture and ancient traditions suddenly meaningful rather than merely quaint. Her customers that day were unusually inquisitive about her new neighbor. Julia deflected their questions, but noticed how their eyes lingered on her with suspicion. Had her association with Ethan already been noted? As dusk approached, Mayor Winters himself entered her shop. A corpulent man with small, shrewd eyes. He had always treated Julia with barely disguised contempt. Miss Ashcroft, he began without preamble. The town council is concerned about the new resident of Ravenshire Manor. We understand you have had interactions with him. Mr. Devereux is a customer, nothing more, Julia replied evenly. Indeed. The mayor's smile did not reach his eyes. Then you might be interested to know that according to town records, a family named Devereux owned that property in the 17th century. They were driven out during the same period as the witch trials. History is full of injustices, Julia said carefully. Or perhaps justified caution. The mayor leaned closer. Your own ancestor narrowly escaped accusation during that time. Curious coincidence, is it not? After he left, Julia locked her shop early and hurried home, unnerved by the mayor's veiled threat. She found Ethan waiting on her porch, his presence both alarming and reassuring. "You were right," she said as she unlocked her door. "The town is already suspicious. Ravenshire has long memories," Ethan replied, following her inside. "During the witch trials, my family protected yours from persecution. It created resentments that have festered through generations. Julia set water to boil for tea, a habit when unsettled. The mayor mentioned records about your family being driven out. A simplified version of events," Ethan said, his voice tight with old anger. "My brother's transgression broke the protective spells the Ashcrofts had cast around our property. It left us vulnerable. The townspeople, led by Winter's ancestor, attacked during daylight when we were weakest." Julia handed him a cup of tea, which he accepted with a small smile. "I do not need sustenance as you do," he explained, "but I enjoy the ritual, the sensory experience." They sat in her small kitchen, an immortal vampire and a woman just discovering her heritage, an oddly domestic scene despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Have you made your decision?" Ethan asked finally. "I have questions first," Julia replied. "The journal mentions blood freely given, but what does that actually entail? What would happen to me?" "A blood covenant is not merely a donation," Ethan explained. "It is an exchange. My blood carries power, memory, enhanced life force. Yours carries possibility, renewal. Together, they create a bond." "A bond," Julia repeated. "What kind of bond?" Ethan's gaze intensified. "One that would connect us for as long as you live. I would sense your emotions, your well-being. You would gain further enhancements to your natural gifts, and glimpses of my memories through blood dreams. And the curse would be broken? If the ritual is performed correctly, yes. I would no longer face extinction with each blood moon. My existence would stabilize." Julia considered this. The journal mentioned the ritual must be performed under the blood moon. "Where?" "There is a ritual chamber beneath Ravenshire Manor. It has remained sealed since 1693, waiting for an Ashcroft to return." The implication was clear. Elizabeth had anticipated this moment, prepared for it across centuries. "Tomorrow night," Julia decided. "I want to see this chamber first, understand exactly what I am agreeing to." Ethan inclined his head. "A wise precaution. I will prepare the manor to receive you." When he had gone, Julia returned to the journal, searching for details about the ritual itself. What she found sent chills through her body. The covenant required not just blood but intimacy, a joining of energies that Elizabeth described in terms both mystical and sensual. The blood exchange was merely the beginning. The true power came from the surrender that followed. The next evening, Julia dressed with care in a long black dress that had belonged to her grandmother. It felt appropriate somehow, connecting her to her lineage as she prepared to step into her heritage. Ravenshire Manor loomed against the twilight sky, its Gothic splendor restored under Ethan's ownership. Inside, candles illuminated corridors lined with artwork spanning centuries. Ethan met her in the grand foyer, his presence commanding in formal attire that echoed a more elegant era. "You look beautiful," he said softly, "like Elizabeth reborn." "You knew her well," Julia observed. "She was remarkable, fearless, brilliant." A shadow crossed his face. "I failed to protect her in the end." "What happened to her?" "After my family fled, she remained in Ravenshire. The townspeople never proved she was a witch, but they made her life unbearable. She died alone." Julia felt a surge of kinship with her ancestor. Another Ashcroft woman isolated by her gifts, feared rather than understood. "Show me the ritual chamber," she said. Ethan led her to the library, where he pressed a hidden mechanism. A section of bookcase swung inward, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. As they descended, the air grew heavy with age and power. The chamber below was circular, its walls inscribed with symbols matching those in Elizabeth's journal. A raised stone altar stood in the center, surrounded by channels carved into the floor. "Blood channels," Ethan explained, seeing her questioning look. "When filled, They complete the circuit of power necessary for the ritual. Julia approached the altar, running her fingers over the ancient stone. How much blood does this require? More than a token amount, less than would endanger you, Ethan answered honestly. The quantity matters less than the intent behind the offering. On the far wall hung a tapestry depicting the ritual, a woman with her wrist extended over a chalice, a man with inhuman eyes receiving her offering. Their expressions captured something Julia had not expected: ecstasy. The covenant is not merely transactional, Ethan said, following her gaze. It is transcendent. The joining of mortal and immortal creates a unique energy. And after? Julia asked. What becomes of us? That depends on what you wish, Ethan replied. The bond would connect us, but it does not dictate our paths. Elizabeth remained in Ravenshire. Others of your line chose different fates. Julia turned to face him directly. And what do you wish, Ethan Devereux? Once the curse is broken and you are free, what then? His expression softened. In 5 centuries I have known power, wealth, knowledge. What I have never known is peace. Perhaps that is what I seek now. Something in his vulnerability called to her. All her life, Julia had kept people at a distance, believing her differences made connection impossible. Yet here was someone who understood isolation, who had experienced it across centuries. I will help you, she decided. Tomorrow night, under the blood moon. Relief transformed his features. Thank you, Julia. A tremendous crash interrupted him as the front doors of the mansion burst open above. Shouts echoed down the stairwell. Find them. The ritual chamber must be here somewhere. It was Mayor Winter's voice. Ethan moved with inhuman speed, gathering Julia into his arms. We must go. Now. How did they know? Julia gasped as he carried her through a hidden passage behind the tapestry. Old hatred needs little provocation, Ethan replied grimly. The Winters family has passed down stories of my kind for generations. The passage led them to a different staircase and eventually to a small door opening into the garden. They slipped into the night just as flashlights began sweeping the grounds. They will search your home next, Ethan warned as they ran through the woods behind the property. We cannot return to Ravenshire tonight. Where can we go? The blood moon is tomorrow night. Ethan led her deeper into the forest, to a small stone cottage nearly reclaimed by nature. This was Elizabeth's sanctuary. It remains warded against those who would do her line harm. Inside, the cottage was a single room with a fireplace, a narrow bed, and shelves of ancient texts. Ethan lit candles with a gesture, their flames illuminating a space untouched by time. We will be safe here until tomorrow night, he said. Then we must return to the ritual chamber. How? They will be watching both our homes. There are other entrances to the chamber, underground passages that connect to the old church cemetery. Julia shivered, not from cold but from the realization of how precarious their situation had become. Why do they hate you so much? What does the mayor gain from preventing the ritual? Ethan's expression darkened. Power. The Winters family has controlled Ravenshire for generations because they drove my kind away. If the covenant is restored, the balance of power shifts. Your gifts would strengthen. Mine would stabilize. Together, we would represent a threat to their authority. He moved to the cottage's single window, looking out at the night sky. There is something else you should know before you commit to this ritual. Something I have not told you. Julia steeled herself. What is it? The curse that afflicts me has a secondary effect. If not broken, it will eventually claim all those connected to the original covenant, including the Ashcroft line. Your gifts have been fading not just from dilution over generations, but because the curse is consuming them. You mean I would lose my abilities regardless? Worse, Ethan said gravely. The journal entries you have not yet reached speak of physical decline. Elizabeth documented cases of later Ashcrofts developing mysterious ailments that modern medicine would likely diagnose as autoimmune disorders, the body attacking itself. Like my mother? Julia whispered, remembering her mother's inexplicable illness that had claimed her life when Julia was just 16. Ethan nodded sadly. The covenant was meant to benefit both our lines. Its breaking harms us both. Julia sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, absorbing this revelation. So my choice is between performing a blood ritual with a vampire I barely know, or watching my family's gifts vanish while possibly developing a fatal illness. When framed that way, it does sound rather dire, Ethan admitted, a hint of wry humor breaking through his gravity. Despite everything, Julia laughed, a release of tension that felt surprisingly good. 5 centuries of existence, and that is your response? His smile transformed his face, making him appear almost human in his warmth. Immortality teaches gallows humor if nothing else. He joined her on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain space between them. I want you to know that regardless of your decision, I will protect you from Winters and his mob. You have my word. Why? Julia asked. If I refuse the ritual, you face extinction. Why protect me? Because Elizabeth made me promise to safeguard her line, covenant or no covenant. His voice softened. And because in the short time I have known you, I have come to admire your courage, your intelligence, your compassion. Those qualities transcend our unusual circumstances. Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection forming independent of ancient pacts and blood magic. Julia found herself studying his face, seeing beyond his immortal beauty to the man beneath, one who had carried centuries of solitude and regret. Tell me about your life, she said suddenly. Not the curse or the covenant. Tell me about you, who you were before all this. Ethan appeared surprised by the request, but began speaking of his human life in 16th century France, his voice taking on the cadence of a different era as he described his family, his training as a scholar, his fascination with alchemy that eventually led him to the immortal who transformed him. Hours passed as they talked, Ethan sharing centuries of experiences while Julia offered her own stories of growing up different in a small town, of learning her grandmother's craft, of finding purpose in helping others despite their fear of her. Dawn was approaching when they finally succumbed to exhaustion, Julia drifting to sleep with Ethan keeping watch from a chair by the window. She dreamed of Elizabeth Ashcroft performing the ritual, her expression one of rapturous communion as she joined her blood with that of a Devereux vampire who looked remarkably like Ethan. The dream shifted to show generations of Ashcroft women, each with Julia's eyes, some flourishing in partnership with the immortals, others fading into illness and obscurity as the covenant weakened. Julia awoke to find Ethan gone and a note in his elegant script explaining he had left to prepare for the evening's ritual and to ensure their path to the chamber would be clear. He promised to return at sunset. Alone in the cottage, Julia explored Elizabeth's sanctuary, finding journals that continued the story begun in the volume Ethan had returned to her. These pages revealed the depth of the connection between Elizabeth and Valerian Devereux, Ethan's sire, not merely allies but lovers whose bond had transcended the limitations of mortal and immortal. The final entry, dated just before Elizabeth's death, contained a warning. To my descendant who will renew the covenant, know that the blood bond creates connection beyond what words can express. Do not enter it lightly. The ritual will reveal truth that cannot be hidden. If there is no genuine affinity between you and the Devereux who seeks your blood, the covenant will fail. Blood freely given must come from both respect and affection, or the magic will reject it. This is both protection and burden. Choose with your heart as well as your mind. Julia closed the journal, understanding now why Ethan had emphasized the freely given nature of the blood offering. It was not merely consent that mattered, but intention, the emotional truth behind the physical act. As sunset approached, Julia considered her feelings for Ethan. In just days, he had transformed her understanding of herself, revealed a heritage she had never suspected, and shown her possibilities beyond her isolated existence in Ravenshire. Was that enough to create the affinity Elizabeth described? She thought of their conversation through the night, the vulnerability he had shown, the genuine interest he had taken in her life despite its brevity compared to his own. There was something there, a connection forming that might, given time, deepen into genuine affection. But time was the one thing they did not have. The blood moon would rise tonight, Ethan returned as promised at sunset, bringing with him clothes suitable for moving through the forest unseen. Winters has organized a search party, he reported. They are focusing on the roads out of town, believing we have fled. What will happen to them when the ritual is complete? Julia asked as she changed behind a screen. Will you seek revenge for their interference? No, Ethan said firmly. Vengeance is what corrupted my brother, led him to take blood by force. I will not repeat his mistakes. They set out through the deepening twilight, following a path only Ethan could see. The forest gave way to the old cemetery, its ancient headstones tilting at odd angles. Among them stood a mausoleum bearing the Devereux family crest. The original entrance, Ethan explained, producing an ornate key. It has remained sealed since my family fled. Inside the mausoleum, he activated another hidden mechanism, revealing stairs descending into darkness. They followed the passage in silence, the weight of centuries pressing down upon them. The ritual chamber looked different when they finally reached it. Candles burned in elaborate holders, filling the space with golden light. The channels in the floor had been cleaned, revealing silver inlay that gleamed in the flickering illumination. The preparations are complete, Ethan said, his voice now carrying a formal quality that reminded Julia of his true age. The blood moon will reach its apex in 1 hour. Julia moved to the altar, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Elizabeth's journal mentioned that the ritual requires more than just blood. She wrote about a joining. Ethan's expression remained composed, but his eyes betrayed tension. Yes, the blood exchange creates the initial connection, but for the covenant to fully restore, there must be a complete joining of energies, physical and spiritual. You mean sexual union, Julia said directly. In essence, yes. The physical act serves as conduit for the magical exchange. He stepped closer, his immortal presence filling her senses. But I would never demand that of you. We can perform the blood exchange alone. It would not break the curse entirely, but it would buy me time to find another solution. Julia studied him, this immortal being who had shown her nothing but respect despite his desperate situation. Elizabeth's warning echoed in her mind. The ritual would reveal truth that could not be hidden. And if I consent to the complete ritual? She asked quietly. What then? Then the covenant would be fully restored. Your gifts would strengthen immediately. My existence would stabilize permanently. His voice dropped lower. And we would be connected in ways few mortals and immortals ever experience. Would I become like you? No. The covenant extends your natural lifespan and enhances your innate abilities, but you would remain human. That balance is essential to the magic, mortal and immortal in harmony, neither dominating the other. Julia took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing. I consent to the complete ritual. Relief and something deeper flashed across Ethan's features. Are you certain? I am. He nodded once, then moved to a small table where a silver chalice waited. We begin with the blood exchange. When the moon reaches its apex, the channels will activate. Julia watched as he removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a forearm sculpted like marble. From a sheath at his waist, he produced a ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming with ancient symbols. Your blood first, he explained, freely offered. Julia extended her arm, and Ethan took her wrist with gentle reverence. The blade was so sharp she barely felt it as he made a precise cut across her palm. Blood welled immediately, vibrant red against her skin. He guided her hand over the chalice, allowing her blood to drip slowly into the silver vessel. Their eyes met and held, and Julia felt something pass between them, an acknowledgement of the significance of this moment. When he judged the amount sufficient, Ethan pressed a cloth to her palm, stanching the flow. Then, without hesitation, he drew the dagger across his own wrist. His blood was darker, almost black in the candlelight, with an iridescent quality that spoke of its otherworldly nature. As his blood joined hers in the chalice, the mixture began to glow with subtle luminescence. Now we each drink, Ethan said, lifting the chalice first to Julia's lips. The liquid was warm, tasting of copper and something else. Something ancient and powerful that seemed to race through her veins the moment she swallowed. Heat spread from her core outward, a pleasant burning that intensified with each heartbeat. Ethan drank next, his eyes closing briefly as the mixture passed his lips. When he opened them again, they glowed with ethereal blue light. "Can you feel it beginning?" he asked, his voice resonating on multiple levels now. Julia nodded, unable to speak as sensation overwhelmed her. Her perception was changing, expanding. She could see the flow of energy around them, the ancient magic awakening in the chamber's very stones. Above them, through layers of earth and stone, she sensed the blood moon reaching its zenith. As if responding to her awareness, the silver inlays in the floor began to illuminate, energy flowing through the channels like liquid light. "The apex approaches," Ethan said, setting aside the chalice. "The final joining must begin." He reached for her then, and Julia went willingly into his embrace. His lips found hers in a kiss that felt like completion, as if her entire life had been leading to this moment of connection. The ritual became a blur of sensation and magic as they shed their clothing, their bodies joining on the ancient altar as power surged through the chamber. Julia felt Ethan's centuries of existence flowing into her consciousness. His memories, his knowledge, his essence merging with hers in a communion that transcended physical pleasure. In turn, she felt her humanity flowing into him. Renewal, possibility, the vibrant immediacy of mortal experience refreshing his immortal spirit. At the moment of culmination, the chamber erupted in blinding light as the blood moon's power channeled through their joined bodies. Julia cried out as ancient magic rewrote her very cells, enhancing what was already there, awakening dormant potential that had existed in her bloodline for generations. Ethan's voice joined hers, speaking words in a language she somehow understood, the final incantation that would seal the covenant and break his curse forever. The light receded gradually, leaving them entwined on the altar, their bodies gleaming with a subtle luminescence that slowly faded. Julia could feel the changes within her. Sharper senses, clearer thoughts, energy humming beneath her skin. More profound was the connection she now felt to Ethan, a bond that allowed her to sense his emotions, his well-being, his very essence. Not a merging of identities, but a bridge between separate beings. "It is done," Ethan whispered against her hair. "The covenant is restored." Julia sat up slowly, marveling at the absence of fatigue or pain. Her body felt lighter, stronger, filled with vitality. "The curse, broken," he confirmed, his expression one of wonder. "I can feel the difference. The shadows that have haunted me for centuries are gone." They dressed in comfortable silence, the intimate knowledge gained through the ritual making words unnecessary. Julia could sense Ethan's profound gratitude, his relief, and something else developing. A tenderness that had little to do with ancient pacts and everything to do with the woman she was. As they prepared to leave the chamber, a commotion echoed down the passage, voices and the beam of flashlights. "They have found the mausoleum entrance," Ethan said, his enhanced senses detecting what Julia could not yet hear. "What now?" she asked, feeling surprisingly calm despite the danger. Ethan smiled, and for the first time, Julia saw the full extent of his power unveiled, the immortal no longer constrained by curse or caution. "Now we show them exactly what they face," he said. "Not through violence, but through truth." They ascended the passage to find Mayor Winters and several townsmen armed with crude weapons, stakes and silver objects that would have been laughable if not for the hatred in their eyes. "Step away from him, Julia," the mayor demanded. "This creature has bewitched you." Julia felt Ethan's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining. Through their bond, she sensed his strategy and smiled. "No one has bewitched me," she replied, her voice carrying new authority. "I have claimed my heritage, as is my right. The Ashcroft line has renewed its ancient covenant with the Devereux family. Black magic, one of the men spat, witchcraft and blood sacrifice. Knowledge and balance," Julia corrected. The very foundations upon which Ravenshire was built before your ancestors perverted that truth. With a gesture, Ethan extinguished their flashlights, plunging the cemetery into darkness illuminated only by the blood moon overhead. The men gasped, stumbling backward. For centuries, your families have controlled this town through fear and ignorance, Ethan said, his voice carrying easily through the night. That ends tonight. The covenant is restored. The balance returns. We will not allow monsters to reclaim Ravenshire, Mayor Winters blustered, though his voice trembled. You mistake predator for monster, Ethan replied calmly. I have existed for 5 centuries without harming a single soul in this town. Can you claim the same moral clarity, Mayor? Shall we discuss the selective enforcement of laws that has kept your family in power? The disappearances of those who opposed you. The mayor paled visibly even in the dim light. Leave now, Julia commanded, feeling power flow through her words. Return to your homes and reflect on the true history of Ravenshire. Tomorrow we can begin anew, without secrets, without fear. To her amazement, the men turned and departed, their will to fight dissolved by the combined presence of covenant-bound mortal and immortal. Did you compel them? She asked Ethan when they were alone. No. Truth has its own power when spoken with conviction. He gazed at her with open admiration. You were magnificent. They returned to Ravenshire Manor as dawn approached, Julia marveling at her lack of fatigue despite the night's events. Inside, the mansion seemed transformed, or perhaps it was her perception that had changed. She could now see the subtle layers of protective magic woven into its very structure, the living energy that flowed through spaces that had known both tragedy and power. What happens now? She asked as they stood in the grand foyer, new day's light beginning to filter through stained glass windows. That depends entirely on what you want, Julia, Ethan replied. The covenant connects us, but it does not dictate our paths. And what do you want? She countered. His expression softened as he took her hands in his. In 5 centuries, I have existed but rarely lived. With you, I have glimpsed what it means to truly connect with another being. I would explore that connection if you are willing. Julia considered her options. She could return to her small shop, to her isolated existence, albeit now enhanced by her awakened gifts. Or she could embrace this new chapter, this unprecedented partnership with an immortal who had shown her respect, vulnerability, and growing affection. I want to learn, she decided, about my heritage, about yours, about the potential of this covenant. And yes, about us, whatever that might become. Ethan's smile was radiant. Then we begin today, and for as many days as you desire thereafter. As morning light filled the mansion, Julia felt a profound sense of rightness, not despite the extraordinary nature of recent events, but because of them. She had found her place in a legacy spanning centuries, a connection that bridged mortal and immortal worlds. The vampire next door had indeed been hiding an ancient curse. But in breaking it, Julia Ashcroft had discovered not just power but possibility, the chance for a love that transcended time itself.